Welcome. I'm Glen from the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 29 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. This month, we'll take a serious look at U.S. foreign policy. Specifically, we'll see how, instead of providing national security, our military violence actually makes us less secure. In our daily lives, we know better than to think that violence solves problems. But at the national level, the U.S. government routinely threatens and uses military violence all over the world. During this hour, we'll see how militarism actually makes problems worse, and we'll invite you to understand why the government keeps using military violence. A crucial question to ask is, who benefits from war? At the end of this hour, I'll urge nonviolent and socially just ways to achieve more profound and holistic security, not only for our nation, but for the entire world. This one-hour TV program will accomplish 4 goals. One is to help people recognize that military solutions are inherently wrong. They're inherently immoral, unjust, and counterproductive, regardless of which person or which nation is the new enemy. We also will go beyond the familiar national security model and seek nonviolent true security that affirms everyone's humanity with real fairness and peace and justice. We will also see interconnections between peace and other issues. Fourth, we will give you some concepts and some talking points that you can use when talking with other people about these issues. The problems are huge and deeply ingrained, but I really do believe the public can overcome the problems if we are informed, motivated, and bold. So let's understand the scope of U.S. militarism. The U.S. had a Department of War from 1789 to 1947. During that time, more than a century and a half, our nation fought only a few foreign wars. But in an Orwellian irony, since 1947, when the Department of War changed its name to the Department of Defense, the U.S. has been almost constantly at war, and we simply have been pretending that endless wars are for our defense. And so here we see Vietnam, which was not at all for our defense, but for other purposes and for some real stupidity at the national policy level. Since the late 1940s, the U.S. has felt entitled to bomb and attack a great many countries. We have overthrown governments, including functional democracies that U.S. businesses and politicians did not like. We've armed and supported a great many dictators and violent thugs who served U.S. business interests and U.S. geopolitical interests. The U.S. has been fighting wars practically nonstop now for 70 years, but 1942 was the last time Congress actually declared war. All of our subsequent wars have been started by presidents, either with or without approval by Congress, in violation of the United States Constitution, and usually in violation of the War Powers Act that Congress imposed during the Vietnam era. Now the United States has about 800 military bases in other nations, in nearly every nation on Earth. Why does the U.S. have so many military bases in other countries? What functions do U.S. military bases in other countries serve? During the Cold War, the United States created NATO and the USSR created the Warsaw Pact. After the Cold War ended a quarter of a century ago, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. But in contrast, the U.S. expanded NATO and used NATO to push U.S. military bases right up to Russia's borders. And the U.S. government has been threatening Russia with military violence ever since. Nearly 200 years ago, in 1823, U.S. President James Monroe proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine, which unilaterally asserted from the top down, with absolutely no basis in international law, that European nations were prohibited from interfering in any nation in the Americas, and that if they did, the U.S. would react militarily against them. The U.S., in effect, asserted dominance over the future of the Western Hemisphere. Latin American governments came and went, but the U.S. repeatedly intervened there militarily, overthrew democracies, supported military dictatorships, and exploited Latin America economically. Since the 1950s, the U.S. actually helped to overthrow a number of Latin American democracies, including Guatemala, Chile, Honduras, and Haiti, and the U.S. has sponsored military dictatorships and other extremely repressive governments in most of Latin America's nations. Chile had been a democracy since the 1800s, but when Chile's voters elected a socialist president, Salvador Allende, the U.S. government actively helped Chile's military violently overthrow Chile's democracy in 1973. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's national security advisor and U.S. Secretary of State, summed up the policy this way, quote, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." In recent years, especially after the Soviet Union's collapse, many Latin American nations replaced their military dictatorships with real democracies. The U.S. did not help those nations democratize. We did not use the U.S. military to create or protect their freedom, but for many decades, the U.S. armed and supported brutal governments that opposed democracy and violated human rights in nearly all nations in Central America and South America and in several Caribbean nations. Also, since 1946, the U.S. Army has been training Latin American military officers how to repress their own populations and even how to assassinate grassroots leaders and overthrow governments, all at the notorious U.S. Army School of the Americas. People began calling it the School of Assassins, so they changed its name to avoid that embarrassment, just because of bad publicity. But the School of the Americas, the School of Assassins, persisted with its violent purposes, and people are working nonviolently to shut it down altogether. The nonprofit organization working at this is at www.soaw.org. Here you can see a military plane in South America working to deal with the drug issue. The U.S.'s war on drugs has extended into Mexico, Central America, and South America, partly as a gimmick to allow more U.S. military control over their militaries, and also U.S. control over their domestic policies, as this photo has shown. What happens when we frame the public health problem of drug abuse as a war on drugs? What happens when we frame international conflicts as a war on terror? Framing something as a war provokes a war mentality that prevents debate on public policy because dissent could be seen as disloyalty. And so it limits the terms of the debate before you even begin. Also, it polarizes the problem and dictates violent methods instead of more thoughtful and more effective solutions. When an international crisis occurs, Americans want our government to do something. But because militarism has been the U.S.'s default policy, do something is almost always assumed to mean do something violent. Military reactions replace and displace honest diplomacy. We need sincere communication for nonviolent problem solving, but the U.S. discounts that because our government is so hepped up on macho military violence. And our government does that within the U.S. as well. Regardless of which political party controls Congress or the presidency, the U.S. government uses militaristic methods against our own people within our own country. The domestic war on drugs is waged on poor and minority Americans especially, a war with militarized SWAT teams, as you see here breaking into someone's home, and heavy weapons used in residential neighborhoods, here like battering down their front door. Hawks like to say, after 9/11, everything changed, and they repeat it often so as to drill into our brains the notion that we are stuck in endless wars, as Cheney and Rumsfeld and others told us repeatedly. They promote and exploit fear so we will accept the loss of our constitutional rights and so that we will accept the militarization of the Homeland Security Department and the militarization of local police. So we see police using military equipment. The federal 1033 program urges the Pentagon to provide military weapons to local police departments. Local police departments, you'll see, also militarize our domestic scene. They tend to hire military veterans who've been trained in how to occupy and dominate foreign populations, especially foreign populations of color, and they have absorbed experiences and traumas and strong emotions from such violent military experiences. Local police forces hire and deploy these persons to occupy local communities within the U.S., so militarism comes home to roost in our local communities. Local populations, especially in poor neighborhoods and communities of color, are treated like enemy populations to occupy rather than as the public to be served. The government also spies on us as if we were enemies. Is it any surprise then that so many people within the U.S. are experiencing the police and the government as an occupying army, and that police very often overreact with far more violence than is needed in shooting, including shooting unarmed people? Overall, military violence in other countries and also at home have become the default assumption for how to deal with any problem, foreign or domestic. If militarism is the default, this displaces looking for practical solutions that will actually solve the problems. If their only tool is a hammer, they will treat every problem as if it were a nail. Public opinion surveys keep finding more and more Americans saying that our nation is on the wrong track. Why do you suppose those surveys never ask the public whether our nation's excessive militarization is evidence of our nation being on the wrong track? Why don't the surveys ask about that? There are long-standing problems within our society. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King recognized and denounced those problems. In 1967, he criticized the war in Vietnam on several grounds. This photo shows him delivering his famous April 4, 1967 speech at Riverside Church in New York City, the Beyond Vietnam speech. He said that poor people around the world wanted freedom, but the U.S. was keeping them down, so the U.S. was on the wrong side of history. Martin Luther King said that the Vietnam War was wasting money that should be spent on ending poverty. And at that same speech, which was exactly 1 year before his assassination, he bluntly stated, quote, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." Don't the American people now recognize our nation's spiritual death in several ways? Are we seeing militarization as being on the wrong track, as the public opinion polls say? Politicians and mainstream media keep reinforcing our sense of nationalism, so we see things only from a selfish U.S. perspective. But what if we look at international conflicts with the roles reversed? Can we see things from other countries' viewpoints? So here's case one. Imagine if Al-Qaeda had killed or disabled many thousands of young Americans, and if Al-Qaeda had stolen trillions of dollars from the U.S. taxpayers. How would most Americans feel? But it was in Afghanistan and Iraq where the United States government, with bipartisan support, killed and disabled many thousands of young Americans, and the U.S. government, with bipartisan support, wasted trillions of dollars of our tax money, much of it stolen by corruption abroad and at home by giant corporations doing business with the Pentagon. Why aren't Americans angry with our government for such massive betrayal? Why don't the American people consider these facts, these hard realities? And why doesn't this kind of role reversal about who's actually killing Americans, American troops, why doesn't that kind of thinking ever occur to mainstream America? Here's case two about reversing roles. Let's consider a case study about Pakistan, but reversing our roles in ways that the American government, media, and population never mention. Suppose the government of Pakistan became concerned that people in other countries were organizing opposition to Pakistan. Suppose one of those peace organizers lived in your neighborhood. So suppose Pakistan was conducting a drone war and sent a drone into your neighborhood to kill that person, and the drone kills a lot of innocent bystanders, including your neighbors and your family members. How would you respond? How would U.S. politicians respond? How would U.S. news media respond? And so why do we have no empathy for Pakistan's victims of U.S. drone wars, as shown here? That could just as easily have been your neighborhood. Powerful interests keep deceiving American people. Powerful interests keep trying to normalize militarism as both natural and inevitable, and they copy it from the international level and apply it at the domestic level. A few minutes ago, I mentioned Martin Luther King's powerful speech about Vietnam and peace issues. In that speech, King criticized the U.S. for being on the wrong side of history, for violently fighting poor people while militarily protecting the corrupt elites, both in Vietnam and elsewhere. Let's look at how politicians and mainstream media deceive American people. They keep telling us that the U.S. is the greatest democracy in the world and a shining beacon of freedom and liberty. But here are some hard realities that debunk our self-image of democracy and freedom. The U.S. attacks many nations and many civilian populations. The U.S. military violence provokes people to take terrorist actions against us. The U.S. imprisons far more of its people than does any other nation on earth. The government spies on people here and elsewhere. Government actions make Americans feel powerless and undermine our support for our government and make us afraid. Repression of journalists and whistleblowers actually increased during the Obama administration. Tom Englehart's Tom Dispatch article from February 4, 2015 concluded, quote, "In the Obama years, the only crime in official Washington is leaking or whistleblowing. That is, letting the public in on something that we, the people, aren't supposed to know about, the workings of our government," unquote. The government manipulates news media to promote its biased information. Some of what the government says is misinformation, and some is disinformation, outright lies intended to deliberately deceive us for the government's own benefit. And that's something that a government of a free society should not be doing. When politicians and mainstream media and the dominant nationalistic culture replace knowledge with lies, this leads Americans to believe in American exceptionalism, the notion that the U.S. is so special that we are not even bound by international law, and that the U.S. is entitled to attack any other nation on earth if our government chooses to. In ancient times, the writers of Greek tragedies referred to this as hubris, the kind of arrogance that led to tragic outcomes. The U.S. keeps acting on the hubris of American exceptionalism, and we are suffering the consequences. This image of be afraid, be very afraid, is something that has become pervasive, because one way to militarize our culture is to inject massive amounts of fear into it. When we are afraid, we will let the government's powerful military dominate us, and we will let the government spy on us, and we will let the government take away our constitutional rights. They keep promoting fear for their interests against the public interest. We're told to be afraid of various foreign and domestic threats, including communists, foreigners, immigrants, terrorists, Muslims, dark-skinned Americans, homeless people, gays and lesbians, and so forth. This flyer from the Cold War was asking, is the communist timetable for world conquest on schedule? And it's putting out, this was from Radio Free Europe, and it was part of the propaganda of Cold War fear that kept that going. General Douglas MacArthur, however, said this on May 15, 1951, quote, "It is part of the general pattern of misguided policy that our country is now geared to an arms economy which was bred in an artificially induced psychosis of war hysteria and nurtured upon an incessant propaganda of fear." Beware of this approach. That's unquote. Beware of this approach. Somebody has said that war is terrorism with a bigger budget. So there's something to think about. If we were to ask the public whether they want peace, nearly everybody would say yes. But violence and war have become so normalized that many people think war is the way to achieve peace. In our daily lives, we have better sense than to choose violent ways of solving problems. If your neighbor's dog is barking, you don't just go out and shoot the neighbor's dog. If you disagree with some member of your family, you don't just assault your family member. Suppose your car does not run properly. Would you find out what the mechanical problem actually is, or would you simply pound on your car like this person is with a heavy hammer and just beat the crap out of it without understanding why the car does not run properly? For decades, I worked for a Washington state agency that interacted with all of the other state agencies, and sometimes we disagreed with another agency as to what should be done to solve a particular problem. But never in my decades of working for that state agency did any of my coworkers say, let's get a bunch of guns and go over to their agency's headquarters office and start shooting people until they'll surrender to our viewpoint. But that's the default in our national dealings with other nations. If we want to have a civilized world and a civilized nation, we must renounce violence in international matters just like civilized individuals do at the interpersonal level. Why do we allow our federal government to use violence when problems occur, instead of finding out what are the root causes of the problem and then developing plans, preferably cooperatively, to address those root problems? So our task really is to help the American people understand this and to put pressure on the government. Beyond this, the truth is that militarism does not even work. Militarism backfires and makes problems worse. So military solutions are actually the problem. Many people do not see the connection between ends and means. They think that the end justifies the means. But in contrast, Gandhi and King and the Fellowship of Reconciliation all affirm that the ends we reach depend significantly on the means that we use to get there. Whatever we plant is what will grow. An acorn is the seed that grows into an oak tree. Likewise, militarism is the seed that grows into more wars. And likewise, nonviolent solutions are the seeds that grow into peace and real profound justice. In recent decades, there have been many, many examples of the U.S. fighting enemies who are fighting us with weapons that the U.S. had provided to our allies. This photo shows U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld when he was President Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East in the 1980s. Rumsfeld is shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. In the 1980s, the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein when he was fighting a war against Iran. In the 1980s, President Reagan armed Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan's Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union's troops that were occupying Afghanistan. However, the Mujahideen evolved into the Taliban, and that led to Al-Qaeda, and so the U.S. had unwittingly promoted and armed Al-Qaeda and terrorism. This photo shows a Stinger missile from the United States in Afghanistan in December 2001, when we were now at war with those people, and they were using our Stinger missile to shoot back at us. The United States wanted to militarily overthrow Syria's President Assad, so the U.S. provided weapons to some of the armed groups fighting Assad. Also in mid-September 2014, Congress rushed to pass a bill authorizing President Obama to train and arm so-called moderate Syrian rebels to fight ISIS. Many of those people passed their weapons along to ISIS, so ISIS is using the U.S. as weapons to promote terrorism and violence in Syria. The U.S. has a long history of arming one group to fight another, only to discover that the group that we had armed has become a new enemy, so we fought against our own weapons. The brutal U.S. occupation of Iraq prompted people there to create something called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which led to the Islamic State, which created another U.S. enemy which would not have existed if the United States had not already attacked Iraq in 1991 and 2003. In Vietnam, the National Liberation Front, often called the Viet Cong, whom we were fighting, were using many of the weapons that the U.S. had provided to the South Vietnamese Army, which was our supposed ally, but was too corrupt and ineffective to support their corrupt government. This is a long, repetitive story. Military violence nearly always backfires. The U.S. continually creates new enemies to attack. This provokes the creation of even more new enemies, and so on, and so on, and so on. The U.S. treats Iran as an enemy now, but many Americans do not know that Iran had a democracy before the United States and Britain overthrew their democracy in 1953 and installed a brutal dictator in order to exploit Iran's oil. Americans ignore these facts, but Iranians know this very clearly. Navin Bapat from the University of North Carolina found that between 1997 and 2006, U.S. military assistance correlated with a 67% increase in the duration of terrorist campaigns in the country receiving the U.S.'s aid. Jeremy Scahill, the brilliant journalist, has written, quote, U.S. policy has been its own worst enemy. We've created the very threats we claim to be fighting, unquote. In the early 1950s, the CIA invented the term blowback to refer to problems that result directly from the kinds of U.S. behaviors that I've been discussing here. The CIA knows about blowback. They've known about blowback for 60 years, but they and the U.S. government as a whole keep using violence that provokes even more blowback. When ISIS was getting started, they vigorously publicized their beheadings of 3 journalists. Why do you think ISIS publicized these beheadings so vigorously? They knew that their strategy would antagonize the United States and provoke the U.S. into an unwinnable military struggle there. The U.S. politicians and the U.S. news media foolishly took the bait and escalated the U.S. wars there, unwittingly playing into ISIS's strategy. So here's an illustration of the kind of thing we're talking about. We know about how dogs chase their tails. I had some videos to show, but they were just altogether too silly, but you get the idea here. Increased U.S. militarism and drone violence provoke more terrorist reactions, so the U.S. escalates again. And in this vicious cycle, we chase our tail in escalating wars against entire populations in many countries. And of course, the more enemies we create, the more power the Pentagon and the CIA are given, and the more profits U.S. weapons manufacturers make. Here are some examples that we know about. We know about the power of the military-industrial complex and the revolving door they have between weapons manufacturers, Congress, the Pentagon, and around and around and around. Weapons manufacturers hire retired generals and admirals and former members of Congress to promote and lobby for more sales of new military weapons. Military contractors spend $150 million a year on an army of 1,000 lobbyists designed to keep America at war, to protect the Pentagon's budget, and to keep those dollars flowing into their corporate accounts. Weapons manufacturers give generously to political campaigns. Colonel John R. Boyd, he's a U.S. Air Force retired, has been a fighter pilot, tactician, strategist, conceptual designer, and now he's a reformer. He stated, quote, "People say the Pentagon does not have a strategy. They're wrong. The Pentagon does have a strategy. It is, don't interrupt the money flow, add to it," unquote. Are the Pentagon and the CIA deliberately escalating the war on terror to increase their own power and profit? Are they playing the rest of us for fools? Here you see U.S. Senator Byron Dorgan and his quotation. Do you think that the U.S. government, while paying lip service to seeking peace, might actually want endless wars with more enemies? The U.S. government, whose agencies have publicly written about blowback for decades, does not really want to win a war, I believe, but rather to continue provoking new enemies and to conduct endless wars in order to continually shift hundreds of billions of dollars from taxpayers every year into the business corporations that supply the war machine. And this also adds political power to the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, Homeland Security, and the other parts of militarized America. This takes power away from ordinary people, and it subverts honest democracy. If this is the case, then the biggest threat to U.S. security is the recklessly violent military-industrial complex. This deserves a serious public conversation. And in fact, the 99% are onto that. You can see this particular rally of people in California, but the sense of the 99% versus the elite includes the 99% against the military-industrial complex as well, which is also part of what victimizes us economically. They get rich and powerful while endangering and bankrupting the 99%. Ends and means are directly connected, so military solutions make problems worse. I would put solutions in quotation marks. Military solutions are really the problem. They make problems worse. If we want international peace, we must use only peaceful methods. If we want a peaceful and just domestic society, we must use only peaceful and just methods within the U.S. as well, besides the international level. We need a nonviolent foreign policy. How can we start toward a nonviolent foreign policy? Most Americans assume that U.S. foreign policy focuses on advancing democracy, but earlier in this conversation, we debunked that assumption because we are not really promoting democracy in other countries. We're promoting subservience to U.S. business and political agendas. Most Americans also think that we help poor nations with generous foreign aid, but the truth is that most of U.S. aid has a very selfish political agenda, and especially a military agenda, because it's designed more to manipulate than to help. Much of our aid is actually subsidies for nations to buy weapons from U.S. weapons manufacturers. So if you were to devise a peaceful foreign policy, what foreign policy would you devise? Think about your own personal values, the qualities that you believe are ethical and good. Imagine grounding U.S. foreign policies upon your positive values. How would foreign policy be different then compared to what it is now? Many of us would want a foreign policy that is truly nonviolent, is grounded in profound respect for the oneness of the human family, that profoundly respects human rights, that promotes fairness worldwide with social justice and economic justice for all. A foreign policy that protects environments, ecosystems, the climate, and sustainability. And a foreign policy that creates friends worldwide instead of dominating people and provoking enemies worldwide. As a result, we would have a foreign policy that would be friendship. We would not need to fear other nations, and we would not need to be fearing terrorists. One of the first steps toward choosing a nonviolent foreign policy would be to let go of some of the myths and misconceptions that keep us stuck in the current unjust foreign policy. Political and economic elites have propagandized the American people into believing some myths and misconceptions, and here are just a few examples that we need to let go of. During the Vietnam War, the elites kept us at war by telling us Asians don't value human life. We're doing this for their own good, and we are winning the war. Since at least September 11, 2001, the politicians, the military, the media, and U.S. cultural myths have been telling us Afghans and Iraqis were responsible for the September 11 attacks. People in that part of the world have always been fighting, so it's okay for us to do it too. Islam is an aggressive religion that is contrary to Western values, and we are winning the war, and we just need some more time, some more money, and another surge. All of these kinds of lies keep us trapped. Since 1945, the politicians, military, and media have also been lying to us about nuclear weapons and about other hard realities. We must reject all of those lies if we are to achieve peace. We need to let go of America's hubris. Another step toward a humane, nonviolent foreign policy would be to let go of our hubris. A few minutes ago, I mentioned the Greek tragedies that used their term hubris, the kind of arrogance that led to tragic outcomes. The U.S. keeps acting on the hubris of American exceptionalism, the notion that we're above international law, that we can do whatever we please to other nations, even against their populations. And we keep reaping the tragic consequences, just like the old Greek tragedies. Now, if we want a nonviolent foreign policy, how can we help our nation heal from our hubris? What would you recommend as some of the first steps toward a better future? How about some serious psychological work for the American culture? How about some serious spiritual work for our nation? How about recognizing and sincerely apologizing for the harm that our nation has caused? How about paying reparations for damage that our violent foreign policy has caused? You might agree with some of what I've been saying. You might disagree, and that's fine too. We need to have a conversation. Our nation includes some people who would flatly deny a lot of that information. How could we deal with those deniers? The movement to protect Earth's climate is trying to deal with climate deniers, and likewise, if we want to change to a peaceful foreign policy, we'll have to deal with people who deny that peace is possible. So here is what the deniers do. The climate deniers are rich and powerful, so they shape public policy. They deceive and confuse the general public in order to prevent real solutions. Likewise, these 2 points are true also of peace deniers. They are rich and powerful, so they shape public policy to keep war and militarism happening. they also deceive and confuse the general public in order to prevent real solutions, such as moving to a peaceful and just foreign policy. So we can play with each of these problems one at a time if we had time to think it through, and I invite you to do this after you've watched the program. I hope individually and in small groups you'll think creatively to generate answers to two questions. One would be, what strategies and methods might we use to reduce the power and influence of the peace deniers? And two, how could we protect the public from being deceived and confused by the peace deniers? And here's something else to think about creatively as individuals or in small groups. Several famous persons have said war is a failure of imagination. If the dominant orthodoxy in the U.S. is that national security requires military violence, then we are preventing the kind of imagination that will get us out of that default trap of war and that cycle of violence. So here's a good idea to think of. If war is a failure of imagination, what could any of us imagine as creative alternatives, creative ways to function in the world without war and without violence and without domination, but with collaboration and friendship and goodwill instead? I'd like to hear your answers, and it would be fun to get together in small groups and talk about that. Our government promotes military violence as the way to national security, but militarism actually makes us less secure, as we've been pointing out. The default violent way to national security does not work, makes problems worse, so militarism makes us less secure. If we want to truly be secure, we have to stop war, stop the culture of violence, both at the foreign policy level and at our domestic policy level here within the U.S. Instead of a narrow military approach that ends up being suicidal, we need to envision the kind of true security that would improve all aspects of our society. An important first step toward peace would be stopping dishonest speech. For example, why do people refer to the military budget as the defense budget? It is used much more for offense than defense. Let's stop calling it the defense budget. It's the military budget. In recent decades, the U.S. government has used the euphemism, the use of force, instead of the accurate word violence. So when the issue is, should we attack Iraq, it's like, should we employ the use of force against Iraq? When I think of force, I think of what this woman is doing. There's a stuck pickle jar lid, and you got to really twist hard to open that pickle jar lid. That's the use of force. Politicians keep saying force when, if they were honest, they would say violence, and they would say killing. Politicians should admit that our military violence actually kills innocent people. Likewise, war supporters like to refer to surgical strikes, which sound precise and they sound medically clean, when actually U.S. bombs and drones kill enormous numbers of innocent people. But the Pentagon dismisses those innocent people that we kill as merely collateral damage. That's the term, collateral damage, instead of admitting that these are innocent human beings that we have killed. How could ordinary people insist upon language that will be honest and accurate? How could we challenge these falsehoods, these deceptions, every time we hear them? That would be a fun thing to pay attention to and be alert to. We need to look at the big issues of what really makes us secure in more important ways. The image here shows health data from 2014. You'll see on the left side, the best rating was for Japan in the orange vertical line. The United States was 35th on that list of the world, out of the world's nations. The United States ranked 35th in that. You'll see us, the little red line on the right. We are way down the list. Glib politicians keep saying America's number one. The truth is the United States ranks way, way down the list, 34th on a list of 35 developed nations in the well-being of children, according to the United Nations Children's Fund. The U.S. ranks 35th in life expectancy, 34th in infant mortality, 17th in education, 37th in healthcare, and 35th in healthcare according to this table from 2014. So although the United States is number one in military violence, we are way far down the list on quality of life, the things that really make us secure in more important ways. In June 2014, the Institute for Economics and Peace released its annual Global Peace Index. It reported that in 2013, the world spent almost $10 trillion trying to contain and deal with the consequences of violence. All over the world, people know we have better uses for our tax dollars. What would a nonviolent foreign federal budget look like? We've talked about a nonviolent foreign policy, and we'll talk about that again, but just think of what a nonviolent federal budget would look like. That would be something to envision, talk about, and work for. Grassroots people can indeed organize and push for what we want instead of what the elites try to impose upon us. In September 13, the American Peace Movement and others prevented a major military escalation in Syria. We actually convinced Congress at that time to reject Obama's proposal for military airstrikes against Syria. But now the war hawks want to use more violence, so now we need to mobilize again for peace and stop escalating the war in Syria. We can urge the public to say no to war. Congress keeps feeding our tax dollars into our addiction to military violence. How could we reach out to the public and create a strong majority that absolutely says no more war? That would be something to talk about in small groups after we've finished this. Get together with your friends or think about it on your own. In any debate, whoever frames the terms of the debate has a tremendous advantage. If the term security means more violence and more spying on Americans, then the Pentagon is providing security, so anybody who disagrees becomes defined as a threat to public security because, as Bush said after 9/11, you're either with us or you're against us. Several years ago, I wrote about what I call true security, which rethinks what security really is and what true security could be. And let's talk about that for a few minutes now. First, I'll summarize the main points, and then I'll show you some images that contrast true security with the dishonest and violent kind of, quote, national security that the elites try to impose upon us. Leaders in both of the big political parties manipulate American people's fears in order to increase the military and industrial complex's power and serve as the U.S. global empire dominating everybody else. But ironically, militarism and the centralization of power are not the solutions, but are actually the root causes of people's legitimate fears in the first place. The American people are afraid of terrorists, but Americans also have deep, troubling, and valid fears about the crumbling economy, the loss of civil liberties, the deteriorating environment, and a worse future that kids and grandkids will inherit. So if we want true security, we have to work to solve the real problems, the real dangers, the crumbling economy, the loss of civil liberties, the deteriorating environment, and the worsening future. So true security cannot be won by weapons. True security can only be rooted in social and economic justice, civil liberties, a vibrant economy with sustainability, a healthy environment, and humane values. The public really is justified in these kinds of fears about these real problems. For several decades, both political parties, at the presidential level and at the congressional level, have passed laws and appointed officials that have pushed most Americans downward, threatened our retirement plans, hurt our quality of life, degraded our food supply, ruined our environment, restricted the media, corrupted our political processes, and so forth. This is not a partisan matter. Both of the big political parties have made those problems worse. So when Americans feel insecure, these are the reasons that we feel insecure, but the fears are transported by the military-industrial complex and the other elites to project them onto other countries as if somebody else, some poor person in Afghanistan is causing our problems, when really it's the politicians and the economic elites and the centralized, ignorant news media in this country. So Americans' feelings of insecurity really come from gross and specific injustices, such as the ones I mentioned, the social, economic, political, environmental kinds of injustices. And we need to redefine true security as reversing those injustices and solving those problems. So let's promote progressive alternatives, take the moral and political high ground, and win public opinion over to our side. Here are some images coming up that will contrast the typical American way to achieve national security with this better way to achieve true security. So the vision, I know the print is small, but the left column is the typical American way to achieve national security, and it says it's U.S. dominates other countries. The right-hand column is a better way to achieve true security, and that's where the U.S. would cooperate fairly with other countries. The next image shows Bush referred to an axis of evil, and so in his model for national security, his axis of evil was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, and they weren't even allies. These are all three separate nations that he wanted to find ways to attack. The right-hand column is a better way to achieve true security. Martin Luther King never called any people evil, but he identified three evil systems: racism, militarism, and poverty. So instead of targeting bad countries, let's go after fixing these three evil systems: racism, militarism, and poverty. Likewise, we have two columns here about goals. The typical American way to achieve national security is thinking of national security against other nations and doing this through political, military, economic, and cultural dominance. The right-hand column shows a better way to actually have true security, and that would recognize global security and equitable relationships among all nations. It would recognize self-determination, economic well-being for all, and respect for other cultures and other religions. The print here is also very small in detail, but I'll walk us through a few of these. The methods to use, the typical way to get national security has been military action, selling weapons, covert operations, things that we have to control for other nations, practices that support U.S. economic interests, and so forth. The right-hand column shows better ways to actually become truly secure, and this would include things like sincere diplomacy, nonviolent direct action that's actually engaging people positively with nonviolence, multilateral resolution of conflicts, supporting the United Nations in international law and treaties, a new Marshall Plan to eradicate global poverty, unconditional commitment to the poor, and a number of other things, and nonviolence. The motivation currently is hatred, fear, power, and self-centeredness. The alternative for true security would be love, compassion, faith, and justice, and concern for others. The results would be, currently we get global chaos on the left-hand side. On the right-hand column, we would get global community, and that's what we need. So I'm encouraging us to help the American people see that the familiar policies of militarism and dominance and greed are a sham being foisted upon us. Let's empower the American people to reject that false notion of security and affirm the deeper and more profound kind of true security. Let's collaborate with a wide range of allies in strong movement building so that the American people can choose and work together for peaceful, just, and sustainable future. And let's sharply cut the military budget and invest the huge savings in things that will actually make us truly secure. So instead of military violence, let's invest in economic security, food security, health security, environmental security, personal security, community and cultural security, and political security, which includes various kinds of freedoms and civil rights and so forth. So during this hour, we've considered a number of main topics. Here's a screen that you can see if you want to follow up at home. During this hour, we've considered that we've suffered 70 years of endless wars. The elites assume that when people want to do something, it means do something violent and militarize us. But elites have deceived the American people and made violence seem normal and okay. However, militarism backfires. Military solutions are really the problem. We could choose a truly nonviolent foreign policy, and we need true security based on cooperation, not domination. So I invite you to experience this TV program again as a self-guided workshop that you can read or print out from the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation's website. And you can also conduct this self-guided workshop for yourself and your friends, and here on the screen shows how to do that. Simply visit www.olympiafor.org, click the Issues link, and then click the PDF document titled De-Militarize U.S. Foreign Policy Workshop Handout for participants and others. I invite you to print it out and work through it, either alone or better yet, discuss it with some friends. You can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093. Visit our website with lots of good information at www.olympiafor.org. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs whatever you can offer. Thank you so much.